December 14, 1944, Allied Intelligence Headquarters, Spa, Belgium. The war had a strange way of choosing its heroes. While generals planned offensives in mahogany-paneled rooms and soldiers earned medals in muddy foxholes, 53-year-old Henri Dubois spent his nights doing what he'd always done, sweeping floors, emptying wastebaskets, and making sure the brass ashtrays gleamed under the dim lights of the Allied Intelligence Headquarters. Henri was invisible. Not in the romantic spy thriller sense, but in the way custodians have always been invisible, present but unseen, necessary but ignored. Officers walked past him without a glance. Secretaries handed him their coffee cups without making eye contact. To the machinery of war, Henri Dubois was just another cog, as unremarkable as the mop bucket he pushed through the marble hallways of the requisitioned Belgian chateau. The building itself had once belonged to a textile baron who fled when the Germans first came in 1940. Now it housed map rooms, communications equipment, and the constant nervous energy of men trying to predict what Hitler would do next. The Ardennes forest stretched just miles to the east, a dense, fog-shrouded maze of hills and valleys that both sides considered too difficult for any major offensive. That assumption would prove catastrophic. Henri had been working at the headquarters for 4 months, ever since the Allies liberated Spa in September. His wife Marie remained in their small apartment on Rue Léopold, waiting for the day when the war would finally end and their son Jacques would come home from wherever the Germans had sent him after the forced labor conscription of 1943. Every night, Henri walked to work in darkness. Every morning, he walked home in darkness. The winter of 1944 seemed determined to squeeze every drop of light from the world. On this particular night, December 14th, the cold was especially vicious. Henri's breath created small clouds as he worked his way through the third-floor offices, methodically cleaning each room. The intelligence officers had left hours ago, retreating to their quarters or to the officers' club, where whiskey and cigarettes temporarily pushed back the weight of their responsibilities. Room 317 belonged to a signals intercept unit, young men with headphones who spent their shifts listening to German radio traffic, trying to separate meaningful communications from the endless static of war. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and the peculiar electrical scent of radio equipment running hot. Henri emptied the wastebasket first, as he always did. Crumpled papers, cigarette butts, an empty tin that once held English toffees. Then he noticed something wedged behind the steam radiator, a small bundle of papers, probably blown there by the draft, that constantly whistled through the chateau's old windows. He got down on his knees, ignoring the protest of his aging joints, and retrieved the papers. His first instinct was to simply throw them away. After all, classified documents were supposed to go into burn bags, not regular trash, but young soldiers often got careless. But something made him pause. Henri couldn't read English well, but he recognized German words, and he saw numbers, times, coordinates, unit designations. The papers were intercept transcriptions, raw signals intelligence that had been decoded but not yet analyzed. His eyes caught on one phrase, repeated across multiple intercepts: Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. Henri had lived through the First World War. He'd been a teenager when German armies had poured through Belgium in 1914, turning his homeland into a slaughterhouse. He knew that military operations had code names, and code names that referenced the Rhine River meant only one thing: Germany was planning something big. His hands began to tremble, though whether from cold or recognition he couldn't say. The intercepts referenced dates: December 15th, December 16th, times 0530, coded as H hour. Grid coordinates that even Henri could tell pointed to the Ardennes forest, and unit numbers, dozens of them, suggesting not a small raid, but a massive concentration of forces. For 5 years, Henri Dubois had been invisible. For 5 years, he'd watched the war from the margins, cleaning up after the men who fought it, mourning a son he might never see again, aging into obsolescence while the world burned. But in this moment, holding papers that most eyes would have dismissed as yesterday's garbage, Henri understood that invisibility could become power. He looked at the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. Most of the headquarters was asleep. The duty officer would be on the first floor, probably half dozing at his desk. The intelligence analyst wouldn't return until morning, and by morning, if these intercepts were accurate, it might be too late. Henri made his decision. He didn't return the papers to the wastebasket. Instead, he folded them carefully and placed them in his coat pocket. Then he did something he'd never done in 4 months of employment. He abandoned his cleaning cart in the middle of the hallway and walked directly to the duty officer's station. The young American lieutenant barely looked up. "Yeah? Need something?" Henry's English was broken, heavily accented, but he forced the words out. "I find important papers. German attack. Tomorrow." The lieutenant's expression shifted from boredom to irritation. "Look, old man, if you found classified documents, just put them in the burn bag. That's not." "No." Henry pulled the intercepts from his pocket and placed them on the desk with deliberate force. "You read, now, German attack, big attack, tomorrow morning." Something in Henry's intensity made the lieutenant actually look at the papers. His eyes widened. "Jesus Christ, where did you find these?" "Behind radiator. Room 317. They fall. Nobody see." The lieutenant grabbed the telephone, his casual demeanor evaporating. "Get me Colonel Dixon. I don't care if he's asleep. Wake him up. Tell him it's about German intercepts marked urgent. Intercepts that got lost in the goddamn building." Within 15 minutes, the chateau exploded into activity. Lights blazed in every window. Officers rushed through hallways still wet from Henry's mop. Telephones rang constantly. Code machines clattered. Jeeps roared out of the courtyard, carrying warnings to forward positions. Henry stood in the corner of the operations room, still invisible but no longer irrelevant, watching as colonels and majors pored over the papers he'd retrieved. He heard fragments of urgent conversations. 3 Panzer Armies. 6th SS Panzer Army, 5th Panzer Army, 7th Army. Over 200,000 men. They're aiming for Antwerp, trying to split our forces. We've got maybe 8 hours before they hit. A general Henry didn't recognize looked up from the map table. "How long have these intercepts been sitting behind a goddamn radiator?" "At least 18 hours, sir. Maybe longer." The general's face went white. 18 hours. My God. But they had the intelligence now, and in war, now was everything. At 1:23 a.m. on December 15, 1944, Allied headquarters issued emergency orders. Artillery units were alerted. Reserve divisions began moving toward the Ardennes. Fighter squadrons prepared for dawn reconnaissance. The entire military machine pivoted on information that a 53-year-old custodian had pulled from behind a steam radiator. Henry didn't see most of this. At 2 a.m., someone finally remembered he was there and sent him home. He walked through the frozen streets of Spa, his breath forming clouds, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Tomorrow, men would die, that was certain, but perhaps fewer men would die because tonight, a janitor had noticed what others had missed. As Henry reached his apartment, dawn still hours away, he wondered if anyone would remember. Probably not. The invisible rarely earned remembrance. But he would know. And for now, that was enough. December 16th, 1944, 05:15 a.m. Ardennes Forest, forward positions. The fog made ghosts of everything. Lieutenant Thomas McKenna had been awake for 36 hours straight, and the world had taken on the strange clarity that comes just before complete exhaustion. He stood in the forward observation post, a hastily dug position on the edge of a pine forest, watching the fog roll through the valley below like a living thing, erasing the landscape 1 meter at a time. His hands were wrapped around a tin cup of coffee so weak it barely qualified as brown water, but it was hot, and heat was currency in the Ardennes winter. Around him, the 99th Infantry Division held a defensive line that stretched thin across the Belgian-German border, covering terrain that High Command had deemed unlikely for enemy action. That assessment was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. At 05:17 a.m., the field telephone rattled. McKenna grabbed it. OP-7 McKenna. The voice on the other end belonged to Captain Hendricks, battalion commander, and it carried an urgency McKenna had never heard before. "Tom, listen carefully. Intelligence just pushed through emergency orders. The Germans are coming. Not a raid, a full-scale offensive. Armor, infantry, artillery, everything they've got left." McKenna felt his exhaustion vanish, replaced by ice-cold adrenaline. "When?" "Best estimate, 30 to 45 minutes, maybe less. They're using the fog as cover. You need to get your men ready and pull back to—" The telephone went dead. Not disconnected. Dead. The kind of silence that meant the line had been cut. McKenna looked at his watch. 05:18 a.m. He did the math. If the attack came at 05:30 as the intercepts predicted, they had 12 minutes to prepare for the largest German offensive since 1940. 12 minutes to avoid being overrun in the first wave. He turned to his sergeant, a 30-year-old farmer from Iowa named Dutch Kowalski. "Get everyone up, now, full alert. Germans are coming heavy, and they're coming soon." Dutch didn't question it. Good sergeants never did. He moved through the position like controlled lightning, kicking men awake, hissing orders, turning a sleeping outpost into a combat-ready position in under 3 minutes. McKenna grabbed his binoculars and scanned the fog-shrouded valley. Nothing. Just gray emptiness and the skeletal shadows of winter trees. But somewhere in that fog, he knew, thousands of German soldiers were moving into attack positions. Panzer tanks were revving their engines. Artillery crews were loading shells. And none of it would be visible until it was too late. The warning from headquarters had given them something precious. Time. Not much. 45 minutes at most. But in combat, 45 minutes could mean the difference between organized defense and complete annihilation. At 05:25 a.m., McKenna heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but sustained, growing. Not a storm. Artillery. "Incoming!" someone screamed. The world erupted. German artillery had opened fire across the entire front, thousands of guns firing simultaneously in a bombardment that turned the quiet Ardennes morning into hell. Shells screamed overhead, impacting in the rear areas, targeting communication lines, supply depots, headquarters positions. The coordination was perfect, the volume overwhelming. McKenna threw himself into the bottom of the observation post as a shell landed 50 yards away, showering the position with frozen dirt and shrapnel. His ears rang, his vision blurred, but his mind stayed sharp because it had to. This was it. Hitler's final gamble, the last great offensive of the Wehrmacht. The bombardment lasted 17 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt wrong, pregnant with terrible anticipation. Then they heard the engines. Through the fog came the deep guttural roar of heavy armor. Panzer IV tanks, Tiger tanks, Panthers, the best Germany had left, supported by half-track mounted infantry and thousands of soldiers on foot. They emerged from the fog like mechanized demons, their guns already traversing toward American positions. But McKenna's position wasn't caught sleeping. Thanks to Henri Dubois and his accidental discovery, thanks to the frantic midnight warnings that had rippled through the command structure, McKenna's men were ready. Not ready to stop the offensive. Nothing could stop this juggernaut, but ready to fight instead of die. "Anti-tank teams, target the lead vehicle," McKenna screamed. "Machine guns, wait for the infantry. Make every shot count." A bazooka team fired from a concealed position 30 yards to McKenna's left. The rocket streaked through the fog and impacted the front armor of a Panzer IV. The tank slewed sideways, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Not destroyed, but damaged, blocking the narrow forest road and forcing the vehicles behind it to slow. Seconds mattered. Every second the German advance was delayed gave American forces time to organize, to fall back in order rather than panic, to establish new defensive lines. McKenna's machine gunner opened fire, the .30 caliber gun chattering as German infantry advanced through the trees. Men fell. Others kept coming. The Wehrmacht wasn't the invincible force of 1940, but it was still deadly, still professional, still capable of terrible violence. At 05:47 a.m., McKenna gave the order he'd been dreading. "Fall back, alternate bounds, move." The withdrawal was controlled chaos. One fire team covering while another retreated, leapfrogging backward through the forest, fighting for every meter. They left behind equipment, ammunition, the coffee that had been warming on a small fire. They left behind 2 men who wouldn't be making the withdrawal. But they got out. Most of them got out. As McKenna ran through the trees, German bullets snapping past him, he found himself thinking about the warning they'd received. Someone, somewhere, had given them 45 minutes. He didn't know who, didn't know how, but those 45 minutes had saved lives. His life, Dutch's life, the 18 men of his platoon who were still running. By noon, the German offensive had penetrated miles into American lines. By evening, it would be called the Battle of the Bulge. the bulge referring to the massive salient the Germans had driven into Allied positions. Over the next weeks, it would become one of the bloodiest battles in American military history. But it wasn't a complete surprise. It wasn't the devastating first strike that Hitler had planned. Because a custodian in Spa, Belgium, had noticed papers behind a radiator and refused to be invisible when it mattered most. McKenna didn't know Henri Dubois' name. He would never meet him, never shake his hand, never thank him. But somewhere in the back of his mind, as he dug yet another foxhole in the frozen Belgian ground, he understood that someone had given him a chance. And in war, a chance was everything. January 28, 1945. Spa, Belgium, 6 weeks after the battle. The war had moved on, as wars always do. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Hitler's grand offensive, his desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp, had failed. The Wehrmacht had been pushed back across the German border, leaving behind thousands of dead, hundreds of destroyed vehicles, and the last remnants of Germany's offensive capability. The cost had been staggering: 19,000 American soldiers killed, 47,000 wounded, but it could have been catastrophically worse. Henri Dubois knew none of these numbers. He only knew that the chateau in Spa was quieter now, the frantic energy of December replaced by the methodical tedium of occupation. Officers came and went. Papers were filed. The war continued, but somewhere else. He returned to his routine, sweeping floors, emptying wastebaskets, polishing brass that would only tarnish again. Invisible work, performed by an invisible man. On this particular morning, Henri was cleaning the second-floor conference room when Colonel Benjamin Dixon, the chief intelligence officer, entered. Henri instinctively moved toward the corner, ready to make himself scarce, but the colonel raised a hand. "Mr. Dubois, Henri, could you stay for a moment?" Henri froze, uncertain. In 4 months of employment, no officer above the rank of lieutenant had ever addressed him directly by name. Colonel Dixon was a lean man with tired eyes that had seen too many intelligence reports, too many estimates of casualties, too many maps marked with red arrows indicating enemy movements. He carried a folder under his arm. "Do you understand English well enough for a conversation?" Dixon asked, his tone gentle. "Some, sir, not perfect." "That's all right. I'll speak clearly." Dixon sat down on the edge of the conference table, a gesture that somehow made the moment less formal, more human. "I wanted to talk to you about December 14th, the night you found those intercepts." Henry nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "Do you have any idea what those papers meant? What your discovery did?" I know Germans attack. Big attack." "Yes. The biggest German offensive of the war in the West. 3 entire armies. Over 200,000 men. They hit us at dawn on December 16th, exactly when those intercepts predicted." Dixon opened the folder, revealing maps marked with unit positions, battle lines, casualty estimates. "Because you found those papers and brought them to our attention, we had time, not much, but enough, to send warnings to forward units, to reposition some reserves, to prepare." Henry's hands tightened on his mop handle. "Men still die." "Yes." Dixon's voice was quiet. "Many men died. It was one of the bloodiest battles we fought, but Henri, intelligence analysts have been running the numbers. If we'd been completely surprised, if those forward positions had been overrun in their sleep, if our command structure had been paralyzed by the initial assault, we estimate casualties would have been triple, maybe quadruple." The colonel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered streets of Spa. "There's a lieutenant named McKenna, 99th Infantry Division. His observation post received the warning with maybe 45 minutes to spare. Just 45 minutes. His entire platoon would have been killed or captured in the first hour if they'd been asleep when the bombardment started. Instead, they fought, withdrew in good order, and lived to fight another day. 18 men who went home to their families because a custodian looked behind a radiator." Henri felt something tight in his chest, a pressure that might have been pride or grief or the simple weight of understanding consequence. "Multiply that across the entire front," Dixon continued. "Multiply it by every unit that got even an hour's warning, every artillery battery that had time to prepare defensive fires, every tank destroyer team that reached their position before the panzers arrived. You saved thousands of lives, Henri. Thousands." There was a long silence. Outside, a jeep rattled past. Someone shouted orders. The war's machinery continued its grinding work. "Why you tell me this?" Henry asked finally. Dixon turned back to face him. "Because I've been in intelligence for 3 years, and I've learned something important. Wars aren't won by genius alone. They're won by the accumulation of small things. A radio man who stays at his post, a scout who reports what he sees, a cryptographer who notices a pattern, and sometimes a custodian who understands that papers behind a radiator might matter." He extended his hand. Henry, confused, shifted his mop to his left hand and shook it. "The Army doesn't give medals to civilian custodians," Dixon said. "There will be no ceremony, no official recognition. Most people will never know what you did. But I wanted you to know that I know, and that it mattered." After the colonel left, Henry stood alone in the conference room for several minutes, still holding his mop, trying to process what he'd been told. Thousands of lives, 18 men in a platoon, numbers that represented fathers, sons, brothers, people who would return home, who would have children, who would live full lives instead of dying in frozen Belgian forests, because he had looked behind a radiator. That evening, Henry walked home through streets that looked exactly as they had every other evening. The same shops, the same cafes, the same war-worn buildings. He climbed the stairs to his apartment where Marie was preparing dinner, potato soup again, with a small piece of bread. "How was work?" she asked, as she asked every evening. Henry sat down at the table, his joints aching, his hands rough from decades of manual labor. He thought about telling her, about the colonel's words, about the thousands of lives, about mattering. But the words seemed too large for his small kitchen, too heavy for ordinary conversation. "The same," he said finally. Work was the same. Marie nodded and ladled soup into his bowl. Outside, darkness fell over Spa, and across Europe, the war continued its slow, grinding march toward an ending that felt both inevitable and impossibly distant. Henri Dubois would work at the chateau until the war ended in May 1945. He would sweep floors and empty wastebaskets and remain invisible. He would never receive a medal, never be mentioned in histories, never see his name in newspapers. But on one December night, when papers fell behind a radiator and a tired custodian decided to look, Henri Dubois became exactly what every person hopes to become, someone who, in a crucial moment, made a difference. The invisible man who changed everything. The end. Author's note: while this story is fictionalized, it is based on the historical reality that the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive, was partially anticipated by Allied intelligence through intercepted German communications. The role of overlooked information, and the ordinary people who sometimes notice what others miss, remains one of the great recurring themes of military history. This story honors those unnamed individuals whose small actions had enormous consequences,